It was a typical night in Orlando. The streets were filled with the usual buzz. Tourists strolling through the amusement parks, families enjoying the last hours of daylight, and the hum of the nightlife taking over the city. But there was one place, far from the bright lights and excitement, that carried a history darker than anything most people in the city could imagine. The mansion, known by the locals as the Slaughterhouse Mansion, had been abandoned for years. Hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by dense trees and a web of winding, forgotten paths, it stood as an eerie relic of the past. People had long since stopped talking about it, save for the occasional hushed whisper when the wind blew just right. The house had a reputation so terrifying that even the bravest souls steered clear of it. They said that if you listened closely on quiet nights, you could hear strange noises coming from the windows. The sound of scraping, like nails against glass. The soft creak of floorboards shifting beneath phantom footsteps. Shadows that moved on their own, lingering in the windows long after the sun had set. But there was one thing everyone agreed upon. No one who had ever dared to step inside had come out the same. Some claimed they'd seen things that couldn't be explained. Others said it was the house itself, alive, angry, its walls suffocating with secrets. A dark force lived there, and it didn't take kindly to strangers. One night, a group of friends, fueled by youthful curiosity and a healthy dose of skepticism, decided they would be the ones to uncover the truth. They had heard the rumors, of course, the stories of shadows and strange sounds, but they weren't the type to be frightened by old legends. They thought it was all a bunch of superstition, a twisted tale concocted to keep people away from a place no one cared about anymore. Mark, the unofficial leader of the group, had always been the first to jump into trouble. Always the bold one, the one who dared to do what others wouldn't. He was the first to suggest they go to the mansion, and his enthusiasm was contagious. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't so sure. She was nervous, her instincts telling her that this wasn't going to be the kind of adventure they thought it would be. But Sarah, ever the loyal friend, pushed her unease aside. The group was heading into unknown territory, and she didn't want to be the one to back out. The drive to the mansion was filled with tension. The winding roads leading out of the city grew darker and more narrow as they approached the edge of town. The only light came from their headlights, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every turn. As they neared their destination, the trees thickened and the air grew still. There was something oppressive about the quiet. No crickets chirped. No animals rustled in the underbrush. It was as though the very land surrounding the mansion was holding its breath. When they finally arrived, the mansion loomed before them, hidden behind a thick wall of ivy and overgrown trees. It was more imposing than any of them had imagined. Tall, with a dark stone facade and windows that seemed to stare down at them like hollow eyes. The house looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. It felt wrong. It was as if the mansion had been waiting for them, patiently, silently. Mark was the first to get out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he stepped toward the rusted gates. His flashlight beam sliced through the dark, illuminating the creeping vines and the long, forgotten path that led to the front door. He turned back to the others, his face a mix of excitement and challenge. "Let's go in," he said, his voice full of confidence. "What's the worst that could happen?" Sarah hesitated, her hand gripping the car door a little too tightly. She glanced around, the silence pressing in on her like a weight. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She could feel the weight of the air around them, thick with the history of the place. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. But she wasn't about to back out now. Her friends were already moving ahead, their excitement overcoming their fear. "Come on, Sarah," Mark said, flashing her a grin. "You can't be scared. We're just here to look around, nothing more." She wanted to protest, but before she could, the others were already stepping toward the house, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. Mark led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he moved toward the front door. Sarah took a deep breath and followed, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. The others didn't seem to notice, too caught up in the thrill of their little adventure. As they stepped into the mansion, the temperature dropped noticeably. It was subtle at first, just a slight chill that made Sarah pull her jacket tighter around her. But as they moved deeper into the house, the cold seemed to grow, wrapping itself around them like a heavy blanket. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though something was pressing down on them from all sides. The walls of the mansion were covered in layers of dust, and the floors creaked beneath their feet with every step. The house had the unmistakable scent of age and decay, like it had been forgotten by time itself. The beam of Mark's flashlight flickered as he moved it over the cracked walls, revealing faded wallpaper and old portraits of strangers whose eyes seemed to follow them as they moved through the dark hallways. They walked deeper into the mansion, each room more dilapidated than the last. But it wasn't just the decay that made Sarah's skin crawl. There was something in the air, something that didn't feel right. It wasn't just the mansion being old. It was as if something had been left behind, something that refused to leave. The walls whispered. It was faint at first, a soft sound, like wind brushing against the house. But as they moved further, The whispers grew louder. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but she could feel them, like they were reaching out, trying to get their attention, trying to warn them, but the others didn't seem to hear it. They were too busy laughing, joking, and continuing their exploration, oblivious to the growing sense of unease that surrounded them. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Mark didn't seem to notice. He kept walking, his flashlight illuminating the hallway ahead. "It's just the wind," he said, dismissing her concerns with a wave of his hand. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that it had a pulse, and with each step they took, it seemed to grow stronger, more insistent. The house wanted them here, and it wasn't going to let them leave easily. As they entered the main hallway, the temperature seemed to drop even further. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, and she could see her breath hanging in the air in front of her. The house felt colder now, colder than it should have been, even for an abandoned building. It wasn't just the air, it was something else, something deeper, more unnatural. And then, suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood up, and she could feel the tension in the air. Thick, heavy, like the mansion itself was waiting for something. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, came the sound of a door creaking open. It wasn't the wind this time. It was real. A loud, drawn-out creak, followed by an eerie silence. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at Mark, but he didn't seem to notice. He was too busy moving forward, as if nothing was wrong. "Mark," she whispered, but he didn't hear her. And then they all heard it. A scream. Not just any scream, but a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the mansion, as if the walls themselves were alive, crying out for help. It came from somewhere deep within the house, and in that moment, Sarah knew the rumors weren't just stories. The house had a voice, and it wanted them to know. This was just the beginning. The group moved deeper into the mansion, their flashlight beams cutting through the thick darkness. With each step, the air grew colder, heavier, like something was pressing down on them from all sides. The walls around them were covered in decay. The once pristine wallpaper, now torn and peeling. But it wasn't just the physical damage that caught their attention. It was the strange, unsettling symbols that adorned the walls. Some of the symbols looked like they had been carved deeply into the stone, with jagged lines, as though done by nails or claws. They were crude, almost primitive, and some seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light, flickering in and out of view as they moved closer. Others were faint, almost invisible, barely more than scratches across the surface of the wall. But despite the differences, there was something about them that felt wrong. Something ancient and sinister, like they had been left behind on purpose, as if the walls themselves were warning them. The house was alive in a way that words couldn't describe. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by their footsteps, the creak of old wood beneath their feet, and the occasional gust of wind that rattled the broken windows. Every sound, no matter how small, seemed amplified in the air, echoing through the empty halls as if the mansion was listening, waiting for something to happen. And then they reached the basement door. The basement had always been the part of the mansion that intrigued them the most. The locals had spoken of it in hushed tones, warning that it was the source of the house's evil. Mark had heard rumors that whatever curse had haunted the mansion had begun in the basement, a place where the most horrific events of all had taken place. Lisa, who had been doing some research on the mansion, was the first to speak up as they stood before the door. She had read the old accounts, piecing together fragments of stories told by those who had once lived in Orlando. Her voice was a whisper, full of fear and awe. "This is where it all happened," she said, her eyes wide as she gazed at the door. "People say the curse started here, with the death of a family, but no one knows the full story. Some say it was a ritual, others say it was murder. All we know for sure is that this is where everything began." The door groaned as Mark slowly pushed it open. The smell that hit them was immediate, a mix of dampness, rot, and something else. Something that smelled almost metallic, like blood that had soaked into the very wood and stone of the mansion over the years. It was enough to make Sarah gag, but she held her breath and stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. As they descended the narrow staircase, the air became even heavier, as if it was saturated with something dark and suffocating. It was hard to breathe, like there was a weight pressing down on their lungs, making it difficult to take in air. The basement itself was a large, open space, its walls lined with shelves that once held items long forgotten. Cobwebs stretched across the rafters, their threads thick with dust, and then they saw it. In the center of the room was a large circle etched into the floor, surrounded by strange symbols. Symbols similar to the ones they had seen on the walls. They were drawn with precision, carefully placed, as if they had a purpose. The floor itself seemed stained, the dark patches of color looking more like dried blood than anything else. This was the ritual space, Lisa murmured, taking a step closer to the symbols. Some say the family used it for something terrible, something dark. I don't know if it was a curse or a sacrifice, but whatever it was, it worked. It's still here. Mark wasn't listening to her, though. Still feeling the rush of excitement, he stepped forward, his flashlight beam catching the edges of the symbols on the floor. It's just a bunch of old drawings. This place is falling apart. There's nothing here but dust and creepy symbols. Let's go already, he said, brushing past Lisa and moving into the center of the circle. The moment Mark stepped onto the symbols, the temperature in the room plummeted. It was sudden, a sharp drop that made Sarah's breath freeze in the air. She shivered, her body instinctively recoiling, but Mark didn't seem to notice. The temperature continued to drop, the chill seeping into their bones, as if the house itself was alive, reacting to their presence. Then the floor beneath them groaned. It started softly, a low rumble that made the air vibrate. But it grew louder, more insistent. The wood beneath their feet creaked and shifted as if something heavy was moving below the floorboards. Sarah's stomach twisted with dread as the ground seemed to tremble. Her mind raced with the thoughts of the things she had read about. Ghosts, curses, restless spirits that never left their homes. She had never believed in any of it before, but now, standing in the heart of this cursed mansion, she couldn't deny the growing sense of terror that was gnawing at her insides. What the hell is happening? Mark muttered, looking around, his confidence wavering for the first time. The sound of the shifting floorboards echoed around them. And then, suddenly, the room went completely silent. And then, it came. A scream. It wasn't like anything any of them had ever heard before. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was a sharp, high-pitched wail, filled with pain and terror, and it reverberated through the mansion as if it were coming from the very walls themselves. The sound was so piercing that it made Sarah's teeth ache, her head spin, and her heart race in panic. It was a scream that cut right through them, straight to their core. It was the kind of scream that made you feel as though your very soul had been torn apart. Sarah's legs shook, and she screamed in terror. "Get out, now!" She grabbed at Mark's arm, pulling him away from the center of the circle. But Mark stood frozen, his eyes wide, staring at the spot where the scream had come from. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling, his bravado gone. What was that? But it was too late. The scream continued, echoing throughout the mansion, a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once, surrounding them in a suffocating blanket of terror. The house itself felt alive, its walls pulsing with dark energy. Something in the mansion had awakened, a force that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, harder now, the vibrations running through their bodies, making it difficult to stand. The air was thick, swirling with the whispers of the past, and the temperature had dropped to a point where Sarah's breath came out in visible clouds. She could feel the presence of something, or someone, watching them, closing in, growing closer with every second. Mark's cocky attitude had vanished, replaced by sheer panic. "What the hell is going on?" he gasped, stumbling back toward the stairs. But the stairs had disappeared. The door they had come through was gone, swallowed by the shifting walls of the mansion. They were trapped, and whatever was in the mansion with them wasn't going to let them leave. The curse had been awakened, and it was hungry. The scream came again, louder this time, more urgent, reverberating through the entire mansion like a wave of pure terror. It was as if the sound was not just coming from one direction, but from all around them, vibrating through the very walls, the floors, the ceiling. It was impossible to pinpoint its source, but it was there, pressing in on them, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. The scream wasn't just heard, it was felt. It crawled into their ears, scraped at their skin, and gnawed at their very souls. It was a cry from the depths of something ancient, something far darker than they could comprehend. Mark's face drained of color. His confident, fearless demeanor had vanished in an instant, replaced by the expression of a man who had just realized the enormity of the danger they were in. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. It wasn't the casual bravado of a person who thought they were just dealing with an old house. No, this was real terror, raw and primal. The group stood frozen, their hearts hammering in their chests, their breaths shallow and quick. Sarah's mouth went dry, her hands shaking as she clutched her flashlight tighter. She didn't dare to speak. No one did. The scream had silenced them all, leaving them suspended in a moment of sheer panic. For the first time since entering the mansion, it hit them all at once. The gravity of their situation. They weren't just exploring an old, creepy house. This place wasn't abandoned. This place wasn't forgotten. This place was alive. Alive in a way that was much darker and more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. Their eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the scream. But it was as if it was coming from everywhere at once. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air thickening, pressing down on them with every passing second. Every flicker of light from their flashlights cast strange shadows, making it impossible to tell what was real and what wasn't. The oppressive silence that followed was worse than the scream itself. It was a silence so heavy that it felt like the mansion itself was waiting, holding its breath, just like they were. And, without warning, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that it made Sarah's heart skip a beat. She turned to look at the door, her eyes wide with disbelief. The door had been opened just a moment ago. They hadn't even noticed when it had closed. But now, it was sealed shut. It was as if the house itself didn't want them to leave. As if it was trapping them inside, not letting them escape from whatever it was that had awakened. Panic surged through the group. Mark reached for the door, his hand shaking as he tried to open it, his fingers fumbling at the handle. "It won't budge," he muttered, his voice cracking. He pulled harder, throwing his shoulder against the door, but it remained firmly closed. It was as if something had locked it from the other side. They were trapped. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. There was no way out, no escape. They were at the mercy of whatever haunted this house, whatever had been waiting for them. For a moment, they all just stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to open, hoping against hope that somehow it would give. But the seconds stretched on, each one heavier than the last, the silence growing more suffocating with every passing moment. Their eyes wandered around the room again, desperately searching for something, anything that might explain what was happening. But there was nothing, just the shadows, the dust, and the eerie feeling that they were no longer alone. And then they saw it, at the top of the stairs, standing in the dark, was a figure. It was tall, too tall. Its outline was cloaked in shadows, making it impossible to see any details. But one thing was clear. It was watching them. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, at the top of the staircase, its presence filling the room like a dark cloud. The air grew even colder, a chill that seeped deep into their bones. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, but somehow they could feel its eyes on them. Its gaze was suffocating, intense and cold, as if it could see straight into their very souls. There was no mistaking it. Whatever this figure was, it wasn't human. Mark's breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto the figure. His hands trembled, and for the first time, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, barely able to form the words. His voice was shaky, strained. He was no longer the fearless leader of their group. He was just another The figure remained still, silent, its presence hanging in the air like a dark cloud. It didn't make a sound, didn't move an inch, but its mere existence was enough to freeze them all in place. They couldn't look away. It was as if they were caught in a trance, their bodies frozen in fear, unable to do anything but stare at the figure. Lisa, usually the calm and rational one, was the first to break the silence. "We need to get out of here," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling with fear. Now, she turned toward the door, her eyes wide with panic. But Mark's gaze remained fixed on the figure, unable to tear his eyes away. "We can't," he hissed. "The door won't open." As if to reinforce his words, the mansion seemed to respond. The walls groaned and shifted, the floor beneath their feet creaking in protest. the temperature dropped even further until they could see their breath hanging in the air in front of them. It was as if the house was closing in on them, pushing them further into the room. The figure at the top of the stairs remained still, its presence overwhelming. Sarah's heart was pounding so loudly, she thought it might explode. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move, grabbing Lisa's arm and tugging her toward the far corner of the room. "We need to find another way out," she gasped. But the words felt hollow, as if she was speaking to herself more than anyone else. The house was alive, and it was toying with them. Suddenly, the figure at the top of the stairs shifted. It didn't move in a way that was natural, but in a jerky, unnatural motion, as though it was being controlled by something else. It slowly raised its arm, pointing directly at them, its bony finger outstretched. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, a feeling so cold, so terrifying, that she felt like she might freeze from the inside out. Her skin prickled with fear, and her mind raced. "What do we do?" she whispered urgently. Before anyone could respond, the door at the far side of the room creaked. It was as if the house had heard their thoughts. It was offering them a way out. But at what cost? Mark didn't wait. His feet moved before his mind could catch up. Without a word, he ran toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he reached for the handle, a force slammed into him from behind, sending him crashing to the floor. The air around him thickened, and the screams started again. This time, they were louder, more desperate, more filled with pain. The figure moved again, but this time, it wasn't alone. Other figures emerged from the shadows, joining the first, surrounding them. The air was thick with their presence. They were everywhere, closing in on the group. The house wasn't just alive. It was feeding on them, trapping them in its web. The figures were not just ghosts. They were something far worse, something ancient, something that wanted them to suffer. And the echoing scream that had started it all, it was only just beginning. The air in the mansion was thick with dread. Every step heavier than the last. The weight of the house pressing down on them like an unseen force. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, trapping them in a place where time had long since stopped. Mark, still in a daze from the terrifying encounter with the figure, kept his eyes fixed on the shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. Sarah and Lisa were just as shaken, but their desperation for a way out kept them moving, stumbling through the pitch-black halls, their flashlights flickering with every step. The sound of their breaths was loud, punctuated only by the occasional groan of the house settling, or perhaps something else shifting in the dark. "Why can't we just leave?" Sarah whispered, the fear in her voice thick, her hands trembling as she gripped the beam of her flashlight. "Why is the door still locked?" Why won't it open? No one had an answer. The house had become an enigma, its intentions unclear, but its evil palpable. They were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by an unseen enemy that seemed to toy with them, to keep them in the dark. Quite literally. The walls felt alive, like they were breathing, sighing with the weight of the evil that had permeated this place for generations. Every corner seemed to hold a shadow, a presence that watched them, judged them, as if the mansion itself was waiting for them to make the wrong move. "Keep moving," Mark said, though his voice had lost its usual confidence. "We need to find another way out." They pushed forward, creeping through the darkness, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the mansion. There were no windows, no sign of the outside world. It felt as though they had been cut off from reality, stranded in this house of horrors. As they wandered, their flashlights scanned the walls, their beams darting across faded portraits and decaying furniture. It was clear that the mansion had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. But there was something unsettling about how well preserved some of the objects seemed. The old furniture, the cracked mirrors, even the layers of dust. They all seemed untouched by time. It was as if the house was holding onto everything, refusing to let go. They stumbled into what looked like a study or a library, the air thick with the musty scent of old paper and leather. The room was cluttered with bookshelves, most of them empty, save for a few forgotten tomes. As they moved deeper into the room, something caught Lisa's eye. A faint glimmer beneath a pile of rotting wood and debris in the corner. Her heart raced as she moved toward it, pushing aside the decaying remnants of what had once been a sturdy shelf. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lisa didn't answer right away. She was focused on the object buried under the detritus. Her hand trembled as she reached down and pulled out what appeared to be a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, but there was something compelling about it, something that seemed to call to her, urging her to open it. Mark and Sarah gathered around as Lisa carefully flipped the cover open, the pages crackling under her fingers. The handwriting inside was elegant, neat, but hurried in some parts, as if the author had written with a sense of urgency or desperation. The ink was dark, though some of the words were smudged, faded with age. It was clear that this journal had been left behind for a reason. Its owner had wanted it to be found, perhaps as a warning. Lisa read aloud, her voice shaky but resolute. The first entry is dated 1913. Richard Caldwell. This is the mansion's original owner. She paused, her eyes scanning the first few lines, her brow furrowing. "The house, it speaks to me," she read aloud. "At night I..." Lisa's voice faltered as she read those words. The air around them seemed to grow colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, the fear creeping back, but Lisa pressed on, reading the next passage. "It seems," Lisa continued, "that Caldwell, Richard Caldwell, wasn't the man he appeared to be. He writes about strange occurrences, about things moving in the night, things he couldn't explain. At first, it was small things. Furniture out of place, whispers at the edge of his hearing. But as time went on, the whispers grew louder, more demanding." Lisa stopped reading for a moment, her fingers trembling on the page. "He writes here about his wife, Elizabeth, and their 2 children, Hannah and Thomas. He says they've been growing distant, but he doesn't know why. He believes they're being influenced by something in the house, something evil. He's worried they're turning against him." The room felt unnervingly still, the silence pressing down on them like a suffocating weight. Mark and Sarah stood frozen, their eyes wide as they listened to Lisa's voice. The journal seemed to hold a dark power over them, drawing them deeper into its tale, weaving a web that seemed to connect them to the mansion's tragic past. Lisa continued reading, her voice barely a whisper now. In the next entry, Richard writes about his growing paranoia. He believes the house is controlling his family. He can feel its power taking hold of him too. He writes about dark dreams, visions of a shadowy figure, a presence that haunts his every waking moment. He describes feeling like a prisoner in his own mind, unable to escape the grip of the house. It is not the house, he writes. It is the spirit that inhabits it, the evil that lies within. Lisa's voice broke as she read the next line, her eyes wide with horror. Richard Caldwell killed his family. He murdered his wife and children in cold blood. He writes about how the house, the spirit, made him do it. How it told him that he had to end their lives to free them from the curse. But in the end, he was consumed by guilt. The house, the spirit, it didn't release him. It didn't free him. It kept him trapped, alone, in the mansion, with the ghosts of his family. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. That's awful, she whispered, unable to process the horror of what she was hearing. But Lisa wasn't done. There's more, she continued, her voice trembling. The journal speaks of a curse, one that Richard couldn't escape. He writes that the spirits of his wife and children still haunt the house, trapped in an endless loop of suffering. And the scream we heard, it's them. It's their souls, forever, screaming for release. Lisa's voice broke as she finished reading. The room felt colder now, the walls pressing in on them. Mark and Sarah stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just learned. The journal was a record of the mansion's darkest secrets, a warning that had been left behind by Richard Caldwell himself. The curse that had torn his family apart was still alive in the house, still waiting to consume anyone who entered its walls. "This isn't just a ghost story," Lisa said, her voice shaking with fear. "This is real. This curse, it's still here. It's still alive. And we're not just trapped in this house. We're trapped in its nightmare." Mark looked at the journal, his face pale. "We need to get out of here. We need to find a way to leave before it's too late." But as they turned to leave the room, the air shifted again. The mansion seemed to breathe, its walls shifting and groaning. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house, trapping them once again. The curse wasn't finished with them, and the mansion had no intention of letting them go. The house seemed to awaken with an otherworldly groan, as if the very walls themselves were coming to life, stretching and creaking under a pressure that no one could see, but all could feel. It wasn't just the faint noises of an old building settling. This was different. The air grew heavier, oppressive, thick with a malevolent force that seemed to reach out from the very core of the mansion. The floorboards shook beneath their feet, as if something deep within the house was breaking free. Something long held down by time and darkness, eager. Mark, Lisa, and Sarah froze for a moment, their eyes wide with terror, their hearts hammering in their chests. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to escape the suffocating presence that had taken hold of the mansion. But there was no escape. The mansion wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that seemed to delight in their fear. They had been caught, and the house had no intention of letting them go. Desperation set in as they rushed toward the basement door, the one spot they had hoped would lead to freedom. They had read the journal. They had seen the figure. Now they needed to escape before it was too late. But as they reached for the door, something strange happened. It was as if an invisible force gripped the door, holding it shut with an unimaginable strength. Mark yanked on the handle, his breath coming in sharp gasps. But it wouldn't budge. His frustration turned to panic as he pulled harder, but the door remained firmly locked, as though the mansion itself were refusing to let them leave. They turned away from the door, their eyes searching for another way out. But that was when they saw it. The cloaked figure was standing in front of them now, closer than ever, its presence towering over them like a dark specter. The shadows clung to the figure like a shroud, hiding its features, but they could feel its eyes, cold, unfeeling, and full of something ancient. The figure was not a mere ghost. It was something far worse, something born of the mansion's curse. It moved without sound, its steps unnervingly silent, its form as unnatural as the darkness that surrounded it. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for him, but it was as if the figure's presence made the air itself hard to breathe. The space around them seemed to shrink, the walls drawing closer, the house itself growing more oppressive. They were trapped. The figure tilted its head slightly, its movements unnerving in their stillness. Then, with a voice like the wind itself, soft, cold, and hollow, it whispered, "Leave, or you will join them." The words sent a chill down their spines, colder than any winter night. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise, a threat, something far more sinister. The figure didn't need to raise its voice, didn't need to gesture toward them. Its mere presence was enough to freeze them in place, the weight of its words settling into their minds like a stone in their stomachs. Mark's mind raced. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself had wrapped its tendrils around them, holding them in place, keeping them captive. He glanced at Sarah and Lisa, both of them visibly shaking, their faces pale with fear. They were all caught in this nightmare, this living hell, and there was no way out. "We can't stay here," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling with the weight of her fear. "We have to leave. Now." But it was too late. The figure spoke again, this time louder, its voice reverberating through the house, shaking the very air around them. "The final scream is yours." The words hit them like a punch to the gut, and it felt as though the mansion itself had tightened its grip on them. They tried to move, to run, but their legs were frozen, as if they were bound by invisible chains. The walls trembled, the floor shaking beneath them, as if the house were preparing to collapse in on itself. The mansion groaned louder, the walls crackling and splitting, as though the evil that had taken root here for so long was finally ready to consume them. The air grew thick with an oppressive pressure, as if something dark was rising within the walls, something ancient, something that had been waiting for them all along. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how little time they had left. He tried to scream, to warn Sarah and Lisa, but no sound escaped his throat. He looked at them, their eyes wide with terror, and then it happened. The roar, the sound of the house, the mansion itself, shaking and crying out in fury, exploded around them. It was deafening, a sound so loud and terrifying that it felt as though it would tear their ears apart. Their screams were drowned out by the roar. The walls cracked violently, the sound of splintering wood and cracking stone filling the air as the house trembled. The floors buckled beneath them, and dust poured from the ceiling like a torrential downpour. The house was alive, alive with rage, with pain, and with hunger. It was tearing itself apart, shaking and groaning, as if it wanted to swallow them whole. The figure in front of them did not move. It remained still, its presence looming over them like a shadow of doom. The air around them felt suffocating, thick with malevolent energy, the temperature dropping rapidly, as if the mansion were drawing its last breaths. The floorboards beneath them groaned, the very foundation of the house shuddering as though it were in its death throes. Mark, Lisa, and Sarah stumbled backward, each of them gasping for breath, their legs unsteady as the very ground beneath them seemed to shake with the fury of the house. They looked around, desperate for a way out, but the mansion seemed to mock them, its doors closed tight, the windows sealed. The house had trapped them here, and it wasn't going to let them go. And then, the figure spoke once more, its voice a cold, chilling whisper that echoed through the walls. "You are mine now." The mansion shuddered one final time, and then, in a blinding flash of light, everything went silent. The roar, the tremors, the crushing weight of the house's fury, all of it stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that seemed to press in on them, suffocating and heavy. Mark's eyes snapped open. He was lying on the floor, his body aching, his head spinning. He looked around, but there was no sign of Lisa or Sarah. The mansion was still, eerily quiet. The walls were intact, the air still, but there was something wrong. The house felt different now, as if it had consumed them all and left only the echoes of their screams behind. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing in his chest as panic surged through him. "Sarah? Lisa?" he called out, his voice trembling. But there was no response, just the stillness of the mansion around him. The house seemed to mock him, its silence deafening, its presence all-encompassing. He was alone, and the house was waiting. When the authorities finally arrived at the mansion, the scene that greeted them was nothing short of bewildering. There was no sign of struggle. No broken windows or doors. Just the house, standing eerily still in the midst of the night, as if it had swallowed everything whole. The mansion's front doors were wide open, their hinges creaking softly in the cold breeze that swept through the abandoned grounds. The wind whispered through the trees, and the shadows of the overgrown ivy seemed to dance in the moonlight. But inside, nothing. No signs of the group that had entered hours before. No trace of their passing. The rooms were in disarray, furniture overturned, dust kicked up in strange patterns, as if something had been moved or dragged. Yet there was no evidence to suggest what had really happened. The only thing that remained was a chilling, lingering echo that seemed to permeate the very air itself. The final scream. Still hanging in the mansion like an unholy cord, a sound that refused to fade, that refused to be forgotten. It was a scream that had reverberated through the walls of the house, so loud and so full of terror that it had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Even the officers, seasoned in the most grisly of crime scenes, couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had happened here. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't find a single trace of the group. No bodies, no blood, not even the smallest clue as to where they had gone. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, swallowed by the very house they had dared to enter. The authorities were left baffled, unable to explain the disappearance. There was no sign of foul play, no reason to suspect anything other than an abandoned house. But the way the mansion stood there, silent and watchful, suggested otherwise. Weeks passed, and rumors began to swirl around the town. People spoke in hushed voices about the mansion and the group of friends who had entered and never returned. Those who had known the house's dark reputation weren't surprised. The Slaughterhouse Mansion had a long history of strange occurrences, and many believed that the evil within had been waiting for someone to awaken it. Those who had ventured too close to the house before, or those who had lived near it, had always spoken of an overwhelming feeling of dread that seemed to emanate from the very walls. They'd hear strange noises at night, whispers in the wind, and sometimes even the faint sound of screams carried on the breeze. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened that night. The mansion's history was as twisted as the vines that crawled up its walls. It had been built over a century ago by Richard Caldwell, a man whose name had become synonymous with tragedy. The house had once been a place of wealth and beauty, a symbol of his success. But after the brutal murder of his wife and children, a tragedy tied to the curse that had taken hold of the house, it had become a monument to darkness. The Caldwell family's death was never fully explained, and their souls were believed to be trapped in the house, forever screaming, forever unable to find peace. Now, the house had claimed more victims, and no one seemed to know why. No one could explain the strange occurrences, the unexplained disappearances, the ominous pull that the house seemed to have on those who dared to enter. Some people swore that they could still hear the screams, the final scream, on quiet nights when the wind was right. A distant wail that echoed through the trees, a sound so filled with despair and terror that it made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. It was as if the house itself were calling out, summoning new victims to enter, to feed the curse that had never been broken. The mansion became a place of legend, a story that people shared in whispers, their voices filled with both fear and fascination. They would talk about it in the dark corners of bars, or on quiet walks home after the sun had set. They would speak of the strange history of the house, of the terrible fate that had befallen those who had lived there, and of the mysterious disappearances of those who had ventured inside. The town's folklore grew, and with it, the power of the mansion. It became something more than a building. It became a symbol of the darkness that still lurked within the city, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon it, to be drawn into its grasp. But the legend was not just about the house. It was about the scream, the final scream that seemed to echo through time. Always present, always waiting. No matter how many years passed, no matter how many generations came and went, the scream never faded. It lingered in the hearts and minds of those who had heard it. A reminder that the mansion was not just a place, but a living, breathing entity that would never let go. There were always rumors, whispers of strange happenings, reports of eerie sounds in the dead of night, and the occasional sighting of a figure standing in the window, watching, waiting. Some claim to have seen the figure of Richard Caldwell himself, his ghost still wandering the halls, trapped by the curse that had consumed his family. Others spoke of the shadowy figures that would appear at the top of the stairs, just before the scream would echo through the house. It was said that they were the spirits of Caldwell's wife and children, forever trapped in the mansion, doomed to repeat the horrors of their last moments over and over again. For anyone daring enough to enter, there was one rule: never, ever stay until the final scream. No one could explain why, but those who had entered the house and made it out alive swore that there was something in the final moments, something in the last scream, that would claim you if you stayed too long. The scream wasn't just a sound. It was a force, an entity that could reach into your very soul, dragging you into the depths of the house with it. Those who had heard it, those who had stayed too long, were never the same again. They were marked, haunted by the house's presence, by the curse that still lived within its walls. They would see the figure in their dreams, feel the cold weight of the mansion on their chest when they woke, and hear the scream, always the scream, echoing in their minds, a reminder that they were not free. Over time, the mansion fell further into disrepair, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered, and its doors rotting away. The town around it continued to grow, but the house remained, a relic of something dark, something cursed, something that would never be forgotten. People still avoided it, still spoke in whispers about it, and still feared it. But the mansion waited, patiently, as it always had, for another group of curious souls to wander too close, for another victim to awaken the evil within. The curse of the Slaughterhouse Mansion was not just a legend. It was a truth. A horrifying truth that had outlasted the years, the generations, and would continue to haunt the city for as long as the mansion stood. The final scream was never far behind, and as long as the mansion stood, it would never be silenced.